Hello everyone, it's me Bryson P. Welcome to another video. Today we're going to be checking out another new channel, which is Jack Chapel. I'm not sure if that's pronounced correctly. The video is about a bigger crisis on the horizon that is going to last for decades. I'm curious how much has already changed because this video is from April 6th of 2020. So this has been, a little over close to a year and a half now. So I'm sure there's probably some things that maybe are already in action that have progressed. Let's find out and get straight into it. Here we go.
As most of the news talks about enforcing mandatory lockdowns and handing out money to citizens, there has been a problem that has been rapidly expanding in the background of all of this news. And it is a problem that the world has never really seen before. In fact, it might create a crisis that won't just be felt in the next week, the next month, or even the next year, but it might be felt for several decades to come. During World War II, Britain was in the thick of war against the Axis powers. However, Britain ran into a roadblock. They were quickly running out of money. So they began looking to borrow money from both their own future taxpayers as well as the United States and Canada. In 1941, Britain began accepting loans and taking on debt to fund the war. And by 1945, Britain had taken on nearly $10 billion worth of debt from its creditors. At this point in time, Britain's debt to GDP ratio was a whopping 200%, meaning that the country had twice as much debt as its entire market value of all of its goods and services it produces over an entire year. And just some perspective for you is that the World Bank states that
So we just got straight into this. No filler, no fluff, no nothing. Whether it's 100% true or not, that is to be debated in the comments.
once a country reaches above 77% debt to GDP ratio, its economy will begin to slow down from such a large portion of its revenue going towards paying down its own debt. So after the war ended, Britain had amassed a debt that was so large that they couldn't pay it back in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, or even 20 years. You see, on December 29th, 2000,
it's odd how my last video that I created was about Germany and about the Berlin Wall, and then now I create this very next video and it's about a bigger crisis, and we're talking of course about debt and economies, which is along the theme of course of many of my videos, but how it almost starts off talking about of course World War II and Britain and different countries. It just correlates right in line with the videos that I've created.
2006, Britain made its last payment on its World War II debt to the United States and Canada. This means that British taxpayers from 1945 up until 2006 had a small portion of their tax bill every single year go towards the debt that the country accumulated in the 1940s. And for about a decade after World War II, Britain's economy was drastically hindered in part due to their outstanding debt that they incurred. However, their economy eventually recovered thanks to an influx of taxpayers called the baby boomers, as well as some economic reforms and infrastructure investments. But you see, Britain was a little bit lucky. Most of the time, when a country accrues as much debt as Britain did during World War II, they are not so lucky. In 2001, Argentina's debt to GDP ratio reached a high of 166%, which caused
So what is the current GDP right now? We gotta see where we are in comparison. And of course, this was in 2020, so what would it be now?
the country to default on over $100 billion worth of debt. This default made capital move out of the country, and soon the nation saw millions of people enter poverty while unemployment reached a high of 19%. And to this day, Argentina still hasn't fully recovered from its debt crisis that it went through nearly 20 years ago. And similar stories can be heard around the globe. There was Greece in 2012, Zimbabwe in 2006, Venezuela in 2017, and Russia in 1998. The point I'm trying to make here is that even though debt can be a good thing to take on in order to solve today's serious problems, it will almost always have serious long-term consequences that could last for years or even decades.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to be kind of sarcastic or hateful or however you want to put it, but I mean, taking on debt regardless, whether it's a country or just a human being taking on personal debt, or a business taking on massive loans. Any of that type of debt isn't necessarily, it helps for short term, but of course the way that you structure it, pay it back, and many other factors apply that would make it more beneficial. And we're talking on a business and personal loan scale versus a country, and versus how it affects the people for generations. But ultimately, it's in the same field,
So now let's bring this back to the United States. Whether you know it or not, America essentially runs on debt. Historically, America's economy has been so big and has grown so fast that taking out tens of billions of dollars here or there hasn't really been much of a big deal because it was such a small percentage of the country's overall economy. For example, in 2006, the United States had a relatively healthy debt to GDP ratio of about 60%. But then, the financial crisis hit. And during the financial crisis, the United States began scrambling for ways to pump money into the economy. So it began taking out hundreds of billions of dollars and eventually trillions of dollars worth of debt. And some people might think that the United States, along with every other country that took out debt to get through the financial crisis, has paid off some of the debt that they accrued in 2008 and 2009. But actually, the opposite is true. You see, since the financial crisis, many developed countries throughout the world have been accruing more and more debt every single year, while economic growth has slowed. This means that many countries may find it actually more difficult to pay off their debt today than they did during the financial crisis. And here's what I mean. The United States debt to GDP ratio before the lockdowns and this pandemic was around 106%. Canada's was around 88%, Italy's was 133%, Singapore's was at 109%, and Japan's was at an astounding 237%.
237%. Now my question, what was that ratio for in Sweden and for in Denmark, for in the Scandinavian countries, for Finland or for the Netherlands? What about you guys? Was that percentage just as high in comparison?
What I'm trying to say here is that before this crisis even hit, the governments around the world were in more debt than they had ever been in. And then, of course, the lockdowns happened and everything began accelerating. Have you ever wondered how all of these checks that citizens are getting today are being paid for? It's not from the government's bank account because most governments don't have a lot of money right now and have little to no tax revenue coming in for the foreseeable future. All of this is coming from debt. So yes, all of the aid packages and stimulus packages that every country...
That's because you essentially shut down an economy. You have nobody working, you don't have any businesses really truly operating. Then the businesses that are truly operating, such as like Walmart, Amazon, and those major corporations, the tax that they pay is very little, in comparison. We kind of go back and forth on the taxes that everybody pays, but whenever you've got, the entire economy almost at a standstill, then yeah, you don't have any tax revenue coming in because you don't have any, you don't have the tax. You don't have any of that type of revenue coming in. So yeah, any type of, and then also not only that, but the amount that's being pushed out, the amount of money that's being printed, that's being lent out during these times and over the past year and a half, this is not anything new. It shouldn't be anything new. If you have paid attention and watched and just really been involved in what has been going on over the last couple of years, not even just with the coronavirus. This has been going on for years. This isn't necessarily anything new. And it's unfortunate because it's almost like a runaway train right now.
In the world is giving out is essentially a form of debt that its tax-paying citizens will have to pay over the next several decades. In fact, if you live in the United States right now, roughly 1 out of every 10 tax dollars that you send to the federal government goes directly towards the interest payment on the national debt and not towards any government programs. And after this crisis passes, that number will only get higher. So this brings up a scary scenario. Many countries like the United States will accrue so much debt during these few months that they will be unable to pay for some of their government-funded programs in the future. So things like Social Security, which is already...
That right there, a lot has changed in the last year and a half. and before, while this content creator was making this video, because even there he just said, over the next few months, because at this time, whatever it was made was essentially around the same time where we were still talking about it not being as long of a crisis, pandemic of lockdown, restrictions, all these different things. We weren't being told, or we weren't exactly looking at it being a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years down the road, where we're still dealing with this and needing to spend even more money because we have even more lockdowns that have lasted so much longer. We have all these restrictions. We have so much of the economy, so many people still out of work. We have so much that is still just constantly going on that even I don't think that this content creator would have predicted either. That the bigger crisis on the horizon being as close as it really is.
Running low on funds, education, military, healthcare, one or all of those things might be seeing major cuts in the future in order to pay for these stimulus packages today. And if a government wants to keep all of these social programs at their current level without accumulating more debt in the near future, it will have to do something that isn't popular with its citizens, which is raise taxes. Now, I would just like to mention that it is highly unlikely that developed countries like the United States, Canada, or the UK will default on its loans, which would send the countries into an even deeper depression. But it is quite likely that the debt that's being accumulated today will end up slowing future economic growth, raising future taxes, and reducing future funding for social programs. And this effect might radiate for decades to come, meaning that kids born today in 2020 will likely be paying for a decent portion of these stimulus packages when they become adults. And the government debt.
We talk about that all the time. What about gasoline or petrol? Right now, the price of gasoline for us, it is going up. Around this time last year, it was still about $1.90, $1.85, $2, depending on the week, depending on the day. And right now, it is $3.09 if you pay with it's $3.09 if you pay with cash, and it's $3.13 if you pay with a credit card. So that's current gas prices right now. That's per gallon. Whatever the conversion is, 2 liters. I do not know off the top of my head. And it's continuing to go up. It has gone up quite a bit. It's actually gone up by like 20 cents just in the past 2 weeks.
Debt is not the only debt problem that we have in the world right now. You see, before the crisis ever began, households were already racking up record levels of debt too. In 2020, households in the United States had roughly $14 trillion worth of debt, which is the highest debt level in history. And the largest increase in household debt from 2008 to 2020.
While we're talking about the household debt, let's also look at the cost of like all of the supplies to build a house or to fix a house if you have a type of issues, right? So as I've mentioned many times, I work in the heating and air conditioning. I work in sales in different sides to everything that you need to build a house. I work at a company that we do all that. In the past year, we have had multiple price increases. What do? You either pay to have your heating and air conditioning, you either pay the extra $900 that, compared to 6 months ago, or you don't have heat or air conditioning and you don't have a choice. And then on top of that, you've not been at work really, or your work has been limited on hours because you don't have employees. So you're not getting the hours, or you're just not, you're making minimum wage or just making a very low salary. And so not only does it cost $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 to have a new one installed, but then it costs another, $800, $900 more than what it was this time last year. That's where we're at.
Has come from, of course, student loans. In 2008, student loans accounted for roughly $611 billion worth of household debt. Meanwhile, today, it is roughly $1.6 trillion worth of household debt. And when you throw this all together, you will see that the average household has roughly $100,000 worth of debt. Meanwhile, these same households have on average only $8,000 worth of savings. And for people under the age of 30, it's even worse, as they have on average just $2,700 worth of savings. That is just enough to cover 1 month of housing, food, and insurance for the average person. So what this all means is that going into this crisis, the average person was already living paycheck to paycheck with little to no savings and tons of debt. And this was especially true for younger people. It also means that the $1,200 stimulus checks might be able to help some Americans get by for an extra week or two, but it won't be good enough for a long-term solution. The only way to help people avoid missing rent payments, defaulting on their loans, or being delinquent on their mortgages is to lift the lockdowns across the world, but that might not happen for a while. And I can't help but think that as more and more households become unemployed, that both individual and national debt will begin to pile up in order to stay afloat, and this will happen at record levels that we have never seen before. And that being said, we have already surpassed the 2008 financial crisis in terms of unemployment levels, and it looks like we might be heading for an economic dip that we have not seen since the Great Depression. And depending on what other policies are enacted in the near future, we as taxpayers will likely be paying off this 1 to 3 month period of time for the next several decades to come.
So at this time, a 1 to 3 month period for decades to come, what would your projection then be? Would it be a couple hundred years then for the 2-3 years that we're going to experience this? Because from what I've understood and from what I've heard and seen over the last few weeks, they're talking about this still be going on, and the lockdowns and all the mandates that we have now being, for at least another year, at least. So, at that point, we're at the, coming up on the end of year 3. What's the financial and long-term economic outcome to this? I don't really know that we really know, because it changes so rapidly and so aggressively at any moment that a lot of our projections and a lot of our scale models that we have and use, we can definitely get in the ballpark, but how accurate can we really be right now?
But this problem might be a lot worse in the short term for developing countries. In fact, the IMF and World Bank have called for an immediate suspension of debt payments for the world's developing countries, as many are very close to defaulting on their debt. This could create an unprecedented debt crisis in the near future that would likely radiate throughout the entire world. Now, I would just like to mention that central banks are playing a major role in this debt crisis right now and are printing money hand over fist, which is causing a ton of things like inflation and currency devaluation. But it also might help pay down the debt in the future through something called quantitative easing. But that could be a whole video in itself. So who knows? This might be the worst debt crisis the world has ever seen. But maybe not. Only time will tell. What do you think about the debt crisis? Let me know in the comments down below.
I'm quite sure that it'll be a lot bigger financial crisis than we really think it will be. I think that financial crisis, it's already, of course, surpassed 2008, and the housing market is going to have a big crash because of the amount of inflation, the amount of just the skyrocketing prices of houses right now. To build a house, to rent, to own, all these different things. The housing market right now is just crazy. You give a couple years, whenever those prices finally start to come down, and you're going to be upside down, because you can't have the positive equity whenever you're paying right now, a house around here that normally costs $150,000 is selling for $180,000 to $200,000. But then in a couple of years, whenever you're back down to the regular prices or less, it's going to be hard. You're going to have a lot of foreclosures. We've been through this before, and especially around here where I live in a military town, I've seen a lot of houses go up and down, up and down, up and down through foreclosure, and someone else buying it, and then a repo, and someone else buying it. It's honestly the way that it is here. May not be everywhere, and like I've always said, this is my experiences living here in the state of Kentucky. That doesn't mean that that's the same experiences that happen in any other state or in any other city or county or town, because it's so vastly different everywhere in this country and in the world. I can only give you my experiences through my eyes and my own thoughts. That is where I see things right now, and where we're going. It's unfortunate. What else do you really say? I hope you have a great day, great night, whatever time it is that you see this. It's me, Bryson P, and goodbye.